NACDL is the association of the nation's criminal defense bar.
But essentially, the summary of the facts are, this was a federal case, and the charge was drug delivery resulting in death from distribution of heroin laced with fentanyl. So in this case, the decedent died of a suspected drug overdose. He actually had a defibrillator implanted years earlier, so they were able to time his death to within minutes after it last shocked his heart. So ultimately, the scene was the decedent was found laying face up on his back on the floor of the garage. One of his sleeves was pushed up, and he had bruising on his arm, consistent with intravenous drug use. They found an empty syringe and a burnt spoon near the body. Residue from the spoon tested positive for heroin and fentanyl. The empty syringe did not contain enough material to provide an identification, and no leftover drugs were found in the garage, and officers did not search his home beyond that area. So toxicology was taken on both blood and urine. So the blood results tested positive for fentanyl and cocaine metabolites. The urine tested positive for fentanyl metabolites, and heroin metabolites, specifically morphine. And so the cause of death was ruled acute combined drug toxicity from cocaine and fentanyl. So other sort of contextual information, of course, there were text messages from our client that he had sold John heroin laced with fentanyl the night before he died. A law enforcement expert testified that the texts were consistent with a heroin sale, and that the sale had in fact occurred. Of course, that the terms, quantity, and price discussed via text were consistent with a heroin transaction, including a transaction of heroin laced with fentanyl. So the state's theory, of course, is that our client sold John heroin laced with fentanyl the night before he overdosed, and that those drugs that he sold resulted in his death. And so they allege both that fentanyl was an independent sufficient cause, but was also a but-for cause. We're going to focus on the but-for cause in this. And the defense theory is that they cannot establish that the fentanyl that caused John's death was from the mixture of heroin and fentanyl that our client sold John. And so the testimony of the medical examiner on direct, who in this case is going to be a physician but not a pathologist, is that John used the drugs and immediately collapsed and then died. And that it was the fentanyl, either alone or mixed with another drug, that causes death. And so our goal here is to establish that the absence of 6-MAM and or morphine in the blood means that the fentanyl that killed John did not come from the heroin laced with fentanyl sold by our client. So with that, we'll sort of get into the cross. Did you get this?
No. So remind me who I am.
So she is a medical examiner. She's a physician, but not a pathologist, not a toxicologist either. And we're going to go somewhat quickly. So, of course, you would want to voir dire on qualifications. You would probably want to lay more foundation than I'm going to lay here for some of these questions. But I'm also going to ask a few compound questions, so apologies for all the lawyers. So we'll dig right in. Okay. So your opinion, Dr. Hawes, in this case, is that John died of mixed drug toxicity due to cocaine and fentanyl.
That's correct.
And you did not do the drug testing in this case.
No, I did not.
And that's because you're not a toxicologist.
I'm not a toxicologist.
But you did receive a toxicology report from the toxicologist.
Yes.
And of course, you relied on this report in reaching your conclusions in this case.
I did. Is my microphone on? Okay.
And of course, the toxicologist is the specialist in drug testing.
Yes.
And you could not render your opinions in this. Was that me? You could not render your opinions in this case without the toxicology report.
No, that's correct. I couldn't offer an opinion without the toxicology.
But of course, even when you were reading the toxicology report, you're focused on certain information.
That's correct.
And you're, in fact, trying to identify the drug and or drugs that may have killed John.
Yes.
And you testified on direct that, in your opinion, John overdosed immediately after using the drugs.
Yes.
And so you're looking for information as to what drugs he used right before he died.
Among other things, yes.
And those drugs would, of course, be detected in John's blood.
Yes.
And that's, of course, because although drugs can enter the body's system through a number of different pathways, essentially the process is that they will enter the bloodstream, are then processed by the liver and then excreted in the urine.
Yes, that is correct.
And so essentially drugs will be detectable in the blood before they're detectable in urine.
Yes.
And so depending on the type of ingestion, drugs can be detected in blood within 5 minutes approximately of their use.
Yes, it depends on the drug and it depends on how the drug is used.
But when drugs are used intravenously, they're detectable in blood even faster.
Yes, because you're injecting the drugs directly into the bloodstream as opposed to taking them by mouth.
And so for that reason, one of the things you're focused on, of course, is what drugs and or drug metabolites were found in John's blood in this case.
Yes.
And so metabolites, of course, are the byproducts of the body breaking down the drugs.
Yes, metabolites are what your body turns the drugs into in the process of excreting or removing the drugs from the body.
And of course, when someone dies, the body stops working.
Yes.
And so the body stops breaking down drugs at that point into their metabolites.
Yes, that's correct.
And so no additional metabolites would be formed after a person dies.
No, they wouldn't.
And in addition, the drugs will no longer travel from the blood to the liver to the urine.
Not actively, but there is something called post-mortem redistribution that will allow the drug levels to change and move around in the body. But it's not the same thing that happens when the body is alive.
And so the drug levels may change, but the location of the drugs in the body, whether it's blood, urine, or vitreous eye fluid at the time of death, is where they will still be found when the sample is taken.
That is correct.
And so for example, if a drug is present in someone's blood before he died, it would be present in his blood if blood is taken and tested as part of the autopsy.
Yes.
And the same is true for urine.
Yes.
And of course, you just described the phenomenon called post-mortem redistribution.
Yes.
And that's one of the reasons why you cannot rely solely on drug concentrations alone to establish whether or not the amount present is lethal.
That is one component, post-mortem redistribution. There are other things such as tolerance, what other drugs might be there, and what other types of disease that person has in their body.
And so the toxicology report you received identifies fentanyl and cocaine metabolites in John's blood.
Yes.
And heroin was not identified in his blood.
No, there was no heroin identified in the blood.
Nor were either heroin metabolite.
Correct. There were no heroin metabolites.
And so I want to focus for a minute on the heroin metabolites. So heroin breaks down into 2 metabolites.
Yes.
And so within minutes of using heroin, it breaks down into 6-monoacetyl morphine.
Yes.
And that's known as 6-MAM.
Yes.
And then the 6-MAM further breaks down into morphine.
That is correct.
And so had heroin been used immediately prior to John's death, you would expect to identify 6-MAM in his blood.
Yes, or potentially in other body fluids as well.
And that's because 6-MAM is detectable in blood within minutes, but remains for up to 30 minutes after heroin use.
Yes.
And of course, you testify that in your opinion, John took drugs and died immediately.
Yes, and that was based on the scene information that we had.
And of course, immediately does not mean 15 minutes later.
No.
Or 30 minutes later.
That's correct.
And 6-MAM was not detected in John's blood.
Correct.
And another reason why 6-MAM is important to look for when considering a possible heroin overdose is because 6-MAM is what is called specific to heroin.
That is correct.
Meaning that heroin is the only drug that creates that metabolite.
Yes.
And so the presence of 6-MAM would indicate heroin use.
Yes.
And only heroin use.
That's correct.
But the toxicologist did not find 6-MAM in John's blood or in John's urine.
Correct.
Meaning that John did not have a metabolite specific to heroin in either his blood or his urine.
He did not.
And so I want to talk for a minute about morphine. So morphine is the second metabolite of heroin.
Yes.
And as you stated before, 6-MAM breaks down into morphine.
Yes.
And so morphine is not broken down as quickly as 6-MAM and would be detectable in blood for approximately 24 hours after use.
It could be, give or take.
And the toxicologist did not find morphine in John's blood either.
Correct.
And so meaning that John did not have the second metabolite potentially associated with heroin in his blood when he died.
Correct.
And again, when you believe the death occurred immediately after use, whatever drugs are present in the blood are the most relevant.
Yes.
And the toxicologist did identify morphine in John's urine.
Correct.
But unlike 6-MAM, morphine can be detected in urine for days after use.
Yes.
And so another important distinction between 6-MAM and morphine is that morphine is not specific to heroin.
That is correct.
Meaning that morphine is a metabolite of heroin, but it's also a metabolite of other drugs such as codeine.
Yes. Or you can have morphine from taking just morphine, or it can be a metabolite of other drugs also.
Because, of course, morphine is a drug itself.
Yes.
And so meaning that someone can use morphine without using codeine or heroin.
Yes.
So if I see morphine on a toxicology report, there's no way you can say whether that person used heroin.
Not based on the blood alone.
Or whether somebody used codeine.
Correct.
Or if that person used simply morphine.
Correct.
And so the toxicology results themselves do not tell you whether or not morphine is from, which one of those substances morphine is from.
Correct.
And so you cannot say in this case whether John ever used heroin.
Correct.
And so the toxicology findings are one of the things you considered in concluding that the cause of death was acute combined drug toxicity, cocaine and fentanyl, but you did not include heroin as part of the cause of death.
That is correct.
And so I want to talk for a minute about your training and experience. So your medical background was as a physician.
Yes.
And so prior to being elected medical examiner, you were a general practitioner for 20 years.
That's correct. I did internal medicine.
And as an internal medicine practitioner, you didn't specialize in any particular area of medicine. You were more of a generalist.
Correct.
And you would provide routine health care for patients.
That's right.
Physical examinations, immunizations.
Yes.
And you would diagnose and treat general illness and injuries.
That's right.
But of course, when your patient comes in and has a more serious injury or illness, you would refer that patient to a specialist.
Sure.
That could be a cardiologist, orthopedist, neurologist.
Yes.
And of course, you would rely on that person's expertise and opinions in those specialties.
I would.
Of course, because they've had more additional training, education, and experience in those areas.
Yes.
And that's the same way you relied on the toxicologist in this case.
Yes.
Because again, you're not a toxicologist.
I'm not a toxicologist.
You have no formal training in toxicology.
I do not.
You do not have a master's degree in toxicology.
I don't.
You don't have a PhD in toxicology.
No.
You did not do a medical residency in medical toxicology.
I did not.
Or a fellowship in medical toxicology.
I didn't do a fellowship.
And of course, you're not board certified in toxicology.
I'm not board certified in toxicology.
And of course, you've never actually personally conducted this type of drug testing.
No.
And so, of course, for these reasons, you would defer to the toxicologist as to whether or not the drug testing was sensitive enough to detect really low levels of certain drugs.
I would. I would have to depend on the toxicologist in those findings.
So that was sort of the end of that miniature cross on the heroin. Ultimately, the court overturned that case, and you can read that in the case, because the state had not established that heroin was ingested at all, much less that it caused his death. The chemist also testified in that case and essentially said that the spoon, the residue that was heroin and fentanyl, you couldn't date when the heroin was used or when the fentanyl was used. They didn't have to be used at the same time, so it wasn't indicative of anything in this case. Do you want to do the other one?
It's up to you. Yeah. 236.
So we have one other short cross. Again, there's less foundation laid in this one, but it's if an autopsy is not performed. And so different hypothetical fentanyl and cocaine found in the blood. Clients charged with sale of fentanyl causing death. And so the defense would be that the state cannot rule out cocaine as the independent sufficient cause of death. The fentanyl levels would be minimal, consistent with the amount administered in a hospital. And essentially the argument would be that it was not sufficient to cause death, nor would it have contributed to the cocaine death due to a different mechanism of death. So again, jumping in, less foundation. But so as you were talking about earlier, there are national guidelines for best practice in cases of suspected drug overdose.
There are national guidelines that are published by the National Association of Medical Examiners in addition to other professional organizations, but the NAME guidelines are the most widely known and used.
And of course, these guidelines emphasize the importance of documenting and using all of the information available, including death scene information, autopsy findings, medical history, and toxicology, so that you can reliably figure out the cause and manner of death.
That is correct.
And it's not appropriate to assign a cause of death based on drug concentration alone.
That is right. You cannot rely on simply a number on a toxicology report to establish a cause of death to any medical certainty.
And the guidelines state that for a potential drug-related death, an autopsy is considered best practice for determination of cause of death.
That is correct.
And that's because, of course, there are intervening causes of death that can occur even in a person who is intoxicated.
Yes.
For example, I can be extremely intoxicated crossing the street and be hit by a car and die.
Yes.
And of course, the car hitting me would be the intervening cause of death.
Yes.
And of course, the car accident would be apparent from the scene investigation as well as from my injuries.
That is correct.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, if I can modify my answer, that sometimes that someone can die while intoxicated is very different than dying of an intoxication.
And of course, there are also some natural causes of death that could be an immediate intervening cause of death, even in a person who is intoxicated.
That's correct.
And examples of those things would be something like a stroke, a heart attack, or a pulmonary embolism, such as a blood clot in the lungs.
Yes, that's correct.
And these natural causes of death, of course, would not be apparent based on information from the scene.
Correct.
Or otherwise obviously apparent to the naked eye.
Correct.
But they may be evident on autopsy.
Yes.
And so an autopsy would allow you to either rule them in or potentially rule them out.
That is why an autopsy would be very important to have.
And of course, drug users are at an increased risk for certain diseases that can shorten life expectancy or cause death.
Yes.
And so for a chronic intravenous opiate user, like the decedent in this case, he would have been at risk for developing a heart condition due to bacterial buildup.
Yes, and that is called endocarditis, which is an infection of the heart valves.
And endocarditis would be evident on autopsy?
Yes, it would.
And that would allow you to either rule it in as a cause of death or rule it out.
That is correct.
And as the medical examiner, you are the official who is certifying the cause and manner of death.
Yes.
And so as the official certifying death, national guidelines state that you must use professional judgment to determine whether the natural disease, drugs, or a combination of natural disease and drugs ultimately caused death.
That is correct. It is a professional opinion.
And the only way to rule out an intervening medical cause would have been to do an autopsy.
That's correct.
And even without an underlying medical condition, any amount of cocaine could cause cardiac arrhythmia, which could lead to fatal heart failure.
Yes.
And can you explain what cardiac arrhythmia is?
Cardiac arrhythmia is an abnormal heart rhythm that can lead to death.
And so essentially cocaine can independently cause death.
It can.
And this is true for anyone of any age, regardless of their medical history.
That is correct.
It's also true regardless of whether or not they're a chronic user.
Correct.
So cocaine and or methamphetamine could trigger heart arrhythmia, irregular heartbeat, and death even in a first-time user.
Yes, that is correct.
At any drug concentration.
Yes.
And so while you concluded that the cause of death in this case was fentanyl toxicity, the presence of cocaine in David's blood means that it was taken shortly before his death.
Correct.
And that's because cocaine itself was found in his blood.
Yes.
And of course, you cannot rule out that cocaine caused a heart arrhythmia and death in David.
That is correct. I cannot.
And that's true regardless of whether he ingested fentanyl.
Yes.